Oh, the history books tell it. They tell it so well. The cavalry's charge and the Indians fell. The cavalry's charge and the Indians died. Oh, the country was young then, with God on its side.
They are called Black Indians, and theirs is one of our great unknown American stories. To most Americans, they are a people without a valued or clear history. Many prominent Americans throughout our past have shared this blended African and Native American ancestry. Crispus Attucks, the first American patriot to fall at the Boston Massacre. Frederick Douglass, former slave and great spokesman for emancipation. The famous poet Langston Hughes.
It is a great story, that of the Negro in America.
The renowned singer Tina Turner.
If it was that easy, we would have all been there years ago.
Civil rights leader Jesse Jackson.
Our time has come. Thank you very much.
Despite such a distinguished ancestry, Black Indians are a people whose collective past is barely known. Their identity is often clouded by uncertainty and denial. Born out of the tragic conquest of Indian peoples and their lands, along with the enslavement of Africans, Black Indians are in fact the ultimate survivors in America's difficult struggle with racial and cultural difference. African Americans and Native Americans, the most mistreated and misunderstood people in our history, have forged strong bonds between their cultures. What is it that links these two cultures? What history do they share together and with white society? Has their common ancestry and shared past given them something to be proud of or something to deny?
The kids around my neighborhood used to think I was Cuban at the time because I looked different. So I guess the way it works is people are so used to seeing what is depicted as an Indian within the movies, the old movies and things. So if you don't look that way, they don't expect you to be Indian. They think you're either black or Hispanic or something else.
When we were coming up, it was a bad stigma, I guess, to be Native American. And so, I mean, you was just classified as black, or that's the way you went. And, you know, a lot of the older people, they never told you. I mean, it was a long time before I really found out what my heritage was.
A lot of people that go through the museum, then they go into the portrait gallery, the last exhibit that you're going to see on the second floor, and there's portraits of Mashantucket Pequot people. And they walk in and they're like, they're not Indian, they're black.
I think also because I sometimes had a rather difficult upbringing as a child because I did feel in between, I guess is the best way to put it. When I was first going to school, I went to a private Lutheran school, and I was the only child of color in the entire school. And I had wonderful experiences with my teacher, but not such great experiences with the students around me. When we moved to another neighborhood and I went into a public school, it was primarily a black school, and I was thrilled. I thought when I saw more children that had chocolate skin that I'd be able to join in and I'd be more of a part of a group. And that wasn't the case at all. It was quite a shocking and disappointing experience for me to realize that they too thought I was not like them.
I was in Narragansett when to be an Indian really was unheard of, because when I was in school, we were taught Eastern Indian history as if it was like learning about the ancient Trojans. When I was in the 4th grade, I got sent out of class because one of the questions was, when did Columbus discover America? And I crossed out discover and put invaded.
Invaded indeed. After Columbus, Europeans took over Indian lands, wiping out millions of native peoples with military aggression and devastating diseases such as smallpox, to which the Indians were not immune. Soon enslaved Africans were brought to North America and put to work on land that had once belonged to native peoples.
Patuxet was one of 60 or more bands that we had in the Wampanoag Nation. The people were wiped out in plagues between 1616 and 1618, which is even before the Pilgrims came. It was of European origin, brought here by fishermen and explorers before the Pilgrims came.
It's quite clear that from the first arrival, from the first time that Africans set foot in the Americas, they were intermingling with Native Americans. And the interaction continued, obviously, all the way through Indian removal, and even thereafter, those Indians who stayed in the Southeast were mingling with African Americans.
Well, in the colonial period, one of the very curious things that was happening was a whole new kind of human being created who was of African, Indian, and European ancestry. And in fact, in the colonies, both in North America and the Caribbean, there were all kinds of mixtures of whites and Indians, whites and Africans, Africans and Indians, and new kinds of human beings created. And I think that it's reasonable to say that many British residents of North America were not comfortable with these people, of brown people, yellow people, all different kinds of mixes of people they were encountering.
So you had native slaves, native indentured servants, and African slaves and indentured servants working side by side in various kinds of domestic situations and also on large plantations in the southern part of New England. I'm talking about New England here. One of the things you got was actual intermarriage of some blacks and some Indians.
Indians encountered people of African descent probably as early as they encountered people of European descent. And from the best available evidence, I think that we can infer that they really made no distinction between people of African and European descent. That is, Native people did not have a concept of race in the way that we understand it today. They saw Europeans and Africans as part of the same society, essentially. And consequently, there was not the kind of racial feelings or distinctions that natives applied to Africans that we find later in the relationships between Africans and natives. I think that's a really important thing to understand about early relations between the two peoples, because race is an acquired concept for native peoples in the South, and racism is an acquired feeling. It is a concept and a feeling that's acquired from Europeans. It's one of the legacies of colonization in North America.
Another legacy was domination by European settlers. From the beginning, African and Indian peoples encountered each other under the controlling power of Europeans. And from the beginning, Europeans saw the alliance of these two peoples as a dangerous thing.
It was certainly in the interest of European Americans to keep Native Americans and African Americans apart. Such an alliance developed and maintained would have been very destructive of the European American attempt to conquer the continent. So African Americans were often used in the militia against Native Americans. Native Americans were often encouraged to hunt runaways and were paid bounties for the scalps of slaves brought in.
We should also understand that Mohawk warriors were constantly hired to be slave catchers. William Johnson's house became like a clearinghouse for catching slaves in this area, runaway slaves from western Massachusetts all the way across to the Genesee Valley. So anytime anybody lost a slave, they'd go to Johnson's house, say, here's what this person looks like, and he would put the call out to Mohawk warriors, and they would go out and act as slave catchers and bring them back quite often. Yet they let them live among them too. They treated them as the eyes and the ears on English society. These persons of African descent who lived in English society, understood English thought, understood English values. When they secreted them, either as runaway slaves or they married into the society, they would let them stay and protected them until enough heat was put on them and they were forced to return them.
In colonial New England, the alliances of blacks and Indians were sometimes not only a matter of protection, but also of collaboration. Colonial seaports in the Northeast, especially those involved in the fishing and whaling industries, often used laborers who were of mixed ancestry. And one such black Indian from Massachusetts, Paul Cuffey, made a highly profitable career out of his merchant business that utilized native black connections.
Paul Cuffey is in many ways very unusual. He's unusual because of his great success, and he's unusual because we have ample documentation establishing the fact that he preferred hiring Native Americans, African Americans, and people of mixed heritage. But at that time, the preponderance of mariners from New England ports were, in fact, Indians, Africans, or people of mixed heritage.
Most native and black encounters and alliances took place along the East Coast, usually through intermarriage, especially in the years after the American Revolution. Sometimes these African and Indian relationships came together out of strategic necessity. Other times, out of shared experience, mutual support, and love.
We see by about 1750 or so, with native communities in the Northeast, intermarriage between Indians and blacks. We find intermarriage beginning to occur between Indians and blacks in the Northeast. So that by the 19th century, with Narragansetts, for example, with Pequots, for example, they are seen as people more African than Indian.
There is, in fact, an advantage to an African male slave in 18th century New England hooking up with an Indian woman. Even if indentured, an Indian woman was free, and from the maxim that the child follows the condition of the mother, a slave who had children with an Indian woman would be producing free children, regardless if he should remain enslaved himself.
I guess if you knew anything at all about the history of our country and the fact that these two tribes' experiences somehow meshed in time and in level of tragedy, it seems only natural that there would be black Indians. These two tribes were walking the planet being persecuted by another tribe, that they found solace in each other. They survived by joining together. That's what you do. That's what all humans do in an effort to stay alive.
As historians, we almost never talk about love or emotional support that people provided to one another. You'd have to imagine a person taken from his or her Indian family at the age of 4 and put into servitude in a white household. This person would not necessarily have grown up speaking English and would have found him or herself very isolated. And in their narratives, 18th century Indians do talk about a profound sense of loneliness, isolation, and that their only social contacts were with the other people who were servants or unwaged laborers in these households. So that many of the relationships between African Americans and Native Americans in colonial New England are rooted in this experience of servitude and slavery.
Elsewhere, the alliance between Indians and blacks grew out of military necessity. This was especially true with the black Seminoles of early Florida. Theirs was an alliance that began with slaves fleeing their masters in neighboring Georgia in the early 1800s. These black Seminoles soon proved to be a powerful combination. From the beginning, Africans made valuable contributions to life in tropical America. They transplanted a rice culture they had perfected in Senegambia and Sierra Leone. The Seminole tribe, which took in migrating Creeks as well, was used to accepting people who were different, so welcoming runaway African slaves from Georgia posed no problem.
What we find in the first quarter of the 19th century is a military alliance and an alliance of convenience and an alliance of common purpose forming between the Seminole Indians, or the people who are being generically referred to as the Seminoles, and these slaves, these hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds of ex-slaves who are finding refuge in Florida. They have common goals, and their goals are to retain their freedom and to thwart the determination of the white government to remove them or return them to slavery. Their other common goal, of course, is to find peace, to support themselves and their families, and to live at peace in the land. They took the field, they took the swamp, they took the woods together, and were able to put up a very strong showing in the face of the most severe military pressure that the United States could bring to bear upon them.
It's important to recognize that Indians did not feel a natural kinship with Black Americans, and they were not 19th century liberal abolitionists. So their reasons for joining with African Americans were far different from what we might imagine today. And they did not see people in terms of race, for the most part, in the 18th century. And therefore, these outsiders come to them, and for the Creeks and Seminoles and Cherokees, this it appears to be an opportunity for them to incorporate new people into their tribe, to gain new skills, to gain manpower, to gain warriors, women who contribute to the population of the tribe.
People of blended backgrounds have always had to negotiate their identity in sometimes confusing ways. Much of the confusion that has affected relations between African American and Native American people is rooted in the early American experience. To most white Europeans in the colonies, people of mixed Black and Indian background were simply colored or mulattoes.
The classic example is someone like Crispus Attucks. Now, when he runs away from his master, he was an indentured servant and not a slave. When he runs away from his master in Framingham, Massachusetts in 1750, the original newspaper's announcement posting a reward for his return described him as a mulatto fellow, literally. And in 18th century parlance, at least in New England, mulatto means a person of indefinite pigmentation. That indefinite pigmentation could be a result of racial mixing. That's not necessarily the case. That person could be a mixed European Indian, could be a mixed European African, could be an African Indian mixture, or could simply be an Indian person who Europeans assumed had sort of brownish skin color. There's absolutely nothing to imply in that usage that Crispus Attucks is an African.
Despite the success of Paul Cuffey, or the revolutionary fame of Crispus Attucks, or the brave and successful blending of Africans and Native Americans in the Black Seminole story, American history has left Black Indians burdened by generations of denigration and denial. And it began historically with a bipolar racial system, one that had no place for racial mixture.
Englishmen in North America established a caste system divided between blacks and whites. There was an attempt to maintain white racial purity, and therefore there was an attempt to deny or reject the racial mixtures that went on. Therefore, if you had any degree of African American blood, you were forced to identify as African American.
If you look at the old censuses, you will see people who clearly we know are of Native American ancestry categorized as colored people or mulattoes. So there are many African Americans today people socially identified as African Americans who have Indian ancestry, and I think that's why you see now at the beginning of the 21st century, you see them trying to reclaim their Indian heritage. I think for the first time, they're now being given the opportunity to do so.
Being of the two people in the society that is very much discriminated against, it's hard to be accepted. It's hard to carry out your life in a peaceful manner, because in places that you go, public places or whatever, they have a view about people that are mixed like that, and so you feel strong prejudice.
The prejudice all had to do with being black, and that's being, and I would say that's today, being in a white neighborhood or a black neighborhood, there's still prejudice because of the light-skinned person that I am. So if I were to walk into a predominantly white neighborhood today, or let's say in the past, I would be a nigger. If I walked in a predominantly black neighborhood in the past, I would be a yellow nigger.
A lot of the Indians would go out and pick up potatoes during the harvest of the potato season, because there was huge potato farms. And some of them would refer to the Narragansetts as the potato niggers. If you were not white, you were black.
I believe in the pecking order of the races, that the Native American individuals were most definitely at the low end of the stick. So if you were a Native American at one point in time in history, you wanted to hide that fact just simply for survival reasons. I'm a parent. I am raising Native American children. If their physical being could pass for black or white, then for their safety's sake, I would put down on their birth certificate black or white. And that happened throughout history for a number of years.
Growing up, actually, there was a lot of prejudice as far as Afro-American people always had things to say to you during school, after school, places you go. And then when I would tell people that I was Native American, that's when things would happen. People would be like, oh, you're not Native American. You don't look like a Native American. And I would be like, excuse me, what does a Native American look like? Could you tell me what a Native American looks like? And people couldn't say anything when you asked them that.
I was clearly accepted in Wakefield, Rhode Island, whether I was perceived as being African American or Native. Coming south, clearly I could say that changed significantly and somewhat dramatically. Attending a predominantly white private Christian university, it became clear that indeed I was perceived as being something different, and clearly I wasn't looked at as being Native. I was looked at as probably being African American by virtue of the pigmentation of my skin.
Again, it boils down to the color of your skin, and if you were not of the dominant at that time in this country race of white, Caucasian, then you were treated second class. We were not allowed to go into the restaurants. And I was also married while I was in college, and we were not able to stay at a hotel or to go to a movie and sit in the movie theaters with the Caucasians. So those kinds of prejudices I did feel. I could not go into a restaurant and sit down and have a meal.
I went to college in Arizona, and I visited a friend at Northern Arizona University, and saw a terrible car accident. And 2 Navajo boys were taken when there was a clinic across the street. Were not taken to the clinic. They had to be taken to a Navajo clinic. And these are life-threatening injuries. Take them 10 feet and they could get treated. They wouldn't do that because they were Native American. And that just really shocked me. And, this is in '84, how this can happen now. And it just kind of set you back on some of the prejudice that is still around today.
I came from what you might call two cultures. Although I went to a purely white school, my schooling on the other side was through my elders. Now, for example, when we were convicted of it, the authorities could take our tongues. We couldn't be in meetings. The only place that we could meet without interference was at the Indian Church and Meeting House. And there we got around that and did our tribal business, because instead of having a tribal council, we had a church council. Instead of, say, a chief, you had a deacon. Instead of a medicine man, say, a prophet.
We were sitting on the plane one day, my wife and I talking Cherokee, and a lot of the African Americans didn't know what we were. A lot of the Hispanics didn't know if we were Jamaican or Cuban or Latino, and the white passengers in the plane certainly didn't have a clue, because that's the first time they ever heard Cherokee spoken. So we thought that's unique. It takes a Cherokee to understand Cherokee. So I thought that was real amusing. We sitting on the plane talking, everybody staring at us. I don't think they were staring at us because I was black and Indian. They were staring at us because they didn't know what we were saying, conversing in, or what language.
We have to face it. There were and still are times when being a person of color is not necessarily a good thing. And when you are made to feel uncomfortable and inferior with that reality, you certainly are not going to share it and be very open about it.
When I was in the tribal attorney's office, there was a woman there who made some derogatory, a showband woman who made some derogatory comments about blacks, just casual comments about those people and how they talk and that kind of thing. And she didn't realize I was black. I could tell she didn't realize I was, but this was early on. And I called her on it. And, the whole office, we got together and talked a little bit about that Valerie's, mixed black and that comment. She was offended, and, you ought to be. And she apologized to me, and things went on.
Because of generations of prejudice and denial, much of the public and sometimes the personal memory of black Indians has been erased by those who write history and sometimes by those who live it.
At that time, there was a lot of people that was using what we call pencil genocide. In other words, they were changing documents in the town halls and this and that, and unless you had some question about it, you didn't even know it. So, for example, in my dad's family, my Aunt Marion, my Aunt Josephine, and my Uncle Lewis were down as Indian. Uncle Lawrence and my father were down as black. My mother's birth certificate, she was born on Cogswell Street, which is Pawcatuck, Connecticut. And the doctor, knowing that she wasn't black, naturally, because he was very well familiar with the Babcock family, put her down as white. And a lot of us were put down as white just so we would not have that stigma of being black.
I call it like erasing the ancestors. Or even erasing us. They just want to erase until they get to the point where, you can look and, oh, look, there's Indian Road and Sachem Street, and, there's nothing left but the street signs and some cigar store Indian.
You can go to any place in the state of Oklahoma, and every place, every few miles up and down the highway, depending upon what nation you're in, you will find all kinds of gift shops and see things, come and get a Cherokee doll, or come play some Choctaw or Creek Nation bingo, and come and do this and do that. And you can go to every one of those shops. You can go to the capital of the Choctaw Nation in Durant, or go to the capital in Tahlequah, and you won't find anything representing the thousands of African people who lived there. Thousands, not just a handful or a few dozen, thousands who were documented on the rolls. Over 20,000 African people were there. They weren't just there and invisible and doing nothing.
My grandmother never really talked much about her Native American heritage. When I think back on my memories of her, the things that she did that I identified as being Native American, I think she did merely because she didn't know what else to do. That's the way she was trained, that's the way she was taught. But if you were to ask her to face those things or identify those things as being particularly one, thing or another, she would back off from that. She never, ever really wanted to share much of it.
When I would go to the various establishments, there was a color line there. And one place that I went to, it was a dance, and we went in there, and there was a Indian girl who was at the desk. And she said, "I'm sorry, you can't come in because you're not white." And I said, "Oh, I know that. I'm Narragansett." And she said, "What's Narragansett?" And I said, "A Narragansett Indian from Rhode Island." And she said, "There is no such thing."
Throughout the 19th century, you get every few years a notice of the last full-blooded Narragansett has died. And the last Indian dies and dies and dies. And then by 1880, when hearings to detribalize them take place, part of the topic that is discussed in the hearings on this, and part of the rationale for detribalizing them, ultimately, is that they are not authentic Indians, they are really Negroes.
There's always erasure going on in terms of one's identity, and to me it seems hooked into a particular political time period in which one is living. Now, if you back up to the removal time, you could say teens through the 30s. Removal really began about, as you know, 1817, 1818. If you back up to pre-Jacksonian America, Jacksonian America, and the time of Indian removal, there's no advantage to identifying as Indian, unless it was very important for you to keep your family and kin and nation together. If you were most interested in remaining where you were, because that was sacred ground where you were living, because you did not want to be removed, then there was advantage of identifying as African, which means then you would not be rounded up, put on the rolls, and sent west, but you could stay right where you were. Of course, there is a disadvantage at this time of identifying as African because you run the risk then of being enslaved. But at least you wouldn't be removed necessarily.
For some Indians, identifying as Native or Black has become complicated due to the issue of slavery. For example, Cherokees sometimes enslaved blacks in the early 19th century, not so much out of racism as out of imitation of the southern white planters around them. Eventually, these slaves were freed at the time of emancipation during the Civil War. These Cherokee freedmen discovered that the United States government, under the Dawes Commission, treated them as much less than equal citizens.
Around the turn of the century, the Cherokee were once again part of a government operation known as the Dawes Commission. And at that time, the land which we held in common at one time for time immemorial became individual allotments to Cherokee citizens.
Indeed, the whole construction of the Dawes Roll by which Indian nations were allotted is based on the assumption that blood quantum, that is the degree of any particular ancestry, white, Indian, black, the degree to which you are one of those determines certain cultural characteristics. That is, how able you are to manage your allotment.
It was at that time that the separation as citizens between black freedmen and Cherokee by blood was made. The Cherokee freedmen, if they were not also Cherokee by blood, were not given an allotment and thus were not part of the Dawes enrollment process.
A lot of knowledge that's been erased. The fact that freedman was never in my vocabulary, I never heard that in terms of a designation of my family history. My father always talked about being of part Choctaw ancestry, but his father, who died in 1940, my grandfather, was on the roll as a Choctaw freedman. The last person in our family who died, who was on the Dawes rolls, just died this year. She was 94. She was a Choctaw freedman newborn. And when I spoke with her, and whenever I would talk to her, she would always talk about, well, Grandma was Indian, of course, but she never, and I'm part Indian, but she never referred to herself as freedman.
by the 1960s and 70s, self-identification began to carry increasingly intense political meaning, which did not promote harmony between blacks and Indians.
If a man has not discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live.
Beginning in the late 60s, black power advocates stressed roots and ethnicity in transforming black from a racial category to an ethnic one, dedicated to political action and group betterment.
It would be fitting and symbolic that ships from all over the world entering the Golden Gate would first see Indian land and thus be reminded of the true history of this nation.
Although red power soon gained currency, the civil rights movement at first tended to create tension between the different agendas of blacks and Indians in modern America.
Now, if you move up to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, what's the advantage there of identifying as either African or Indian? Well, this is all tied up in the civil rights movement. The 60s or 70s, the currency there was blackness.
I had a lot of problems in the black community, and they got progressively worse as I got older, and I think part of it was the knowledge that black people were having, the raising of black consciousness with the Black Panther Party and Black Power, and I remember Angela Davis. I remember AIM and Wounded Knee.
Where's claiming Indian ancestry going to get you anyway, when in the 50s, the movement for civil rights is for African Americans? The Brown versus Board of Ed, the civil rights case of 1957, the voting rights case, the civil rights case of 64, the civil rights piece of legislation, Voting Rights Act of 65, those are directed to African Americans. So what does it gain you to declare yourself as Indian? Not till, I'd say, the late 60s, 70s at least.
Right now it's vogue to be Native, whether you're in Lexington, Kentucky, whether you're in Oklahoma, what have you, whether it's through arts, whether it's through museums, it's vogue, it's popular to be Native now. And so it's very easy for people to say, count me, I'm Native as well. And I don't think it's quite that easy.
In the late 20th century, we finally reached a moment in our history where it is possible for members of social groups other than the European Americans to become very, very proud of their heritage, to increase their own awareness of their own heritage. And as a consequence, there are internal pressures inside African American groups to exert their own political influence, their own political force, to find their political voice inside the United States today. This is an absolutely natural and highly commendable movement. Native Americans are doing exactly the same thing in our society today, and they are working very hard to reach the kind of consensus in the Native American world that will give them the power of their own political voices.
Having a powerful political voice is important, but for most people from blended backgrounds, the struggle remains one of finding a clear and proud sense of personal identity.
There is an African American attitude that does not accept the legitimacy of the term Black Indians. All people of African heritage are African. So that the Afrocentric position argues that Black Indians are not Indians, but are in fact African people. So individuals of dual heritage are often caught between white stereotypes about pure blood, what Indians should look like. And on the other side is the Afrocentric position that says that you are not Indian, you are Africans pretending to be something you are not. And, in several instances, this is difficult for individuals. I mean, in many different ways, it places people in positions where they have to negotiate their identity, caught between two extremes, two groups that deny them legitimacy and a place within either community, either the African American community or the Native American community.
At that time in the Black community, it was, everyone was very conscious of black is beautiful, and someone like me and my mother, we weren't black enough. It was difficult because I identified as black and my family identified as black and Indian, and yet we were never quite good enough.
There are elements of self-denial in terms of really exploring the history not in terms of just superficial things. How do we dress, or what are we putting on that looks a certain way? Shall I put on something with kente that's going to make me look, and does wearing the kente cloth make me African, or does wearing a certain choker make me Native American because it's a choker from the Cheyenne Nation? It's something that a lot of people will ask me, why are you even bothering? I mean, is this something that you're trying not to be black by saying that you're Indian? Well, of course I say I'm black first, without question. That's the cultural context in which I've lived my entire life and in which I was raised. Of course, I grew up with, grandma's Indian, and that's something that's there.
Part of it is that old, light-skinned is better no matter what the mixture is, whether it's black and Vietnamese or black and white, but there's a fear that we'll go back to that because it's hard to get rid of one's self-hate and the internalized racism that we have, and I understand that fear. And then there's a certain competition among minorities. Rather than working together the way we could, I think has been at least a tendency to see if where there have been encounters, it's like, I've suffered more than you have. I was enslaved. Well, our land was taken. I've suffered more than you have. And it kind of gets, I think that kind of flavors or colors the interactions.
Much of the talk about identity and political power often leads to a very troubling conflict: blood versus culture. Both Native Americans and African Americans tend to present themselves as an ethnic group rather than a race, but that doesn't mean white Americans see it that way. In the past, especially among Southern whites, blood was either pure or polluted. Quote, "It may take one drop of black blood to make a person a Negro, but it takes a lot of Indian blood to make a person a real Indian."
In Western culture, we have invested a great deal of faith in science. And science is by its very nature empirical. It is called scientific racism, and people became obsessed with it in the 19th century. They tried to determine characteristics of particular races and the way in which you could physically identify people of race. They also began to associate what we often consider to be cultural attributes, things that are learned, to race, to genetic makeup. Now, today, we recognize the fallacy of this, but we continue to use the same kinds of categories. That is, we believe that ethnic identity is largely determined by genetics. And I would suggest that assumption is in and of itself a cultural construction. It's a construction that was developed in the 19th century to serve political purposes. It was a construction that was developed in order to enforce the distinction between white and black, in order to maintain the subordination of blacks and Indians, in order to ensure the dominance of whites.
I'm half Indian, half black, and then we're identified three different ways. One by race, natural origin, or color. And the fact that we're bilingual, we feel like we're just as much Indian as anybody. Just because we have a card, just spells out what degree of blood you are. So the term freedman is offensive to some people, but it's not to me. I think it's part of history that people need to know that people that came over here to Oklahoma on the trailer tiers, not all of them were slaves of Indians or white plantation owners.
I'm a person who wants to be viewed as a person who happens to be arguably a walking melting pot, because I have three distinct bloodlines and possibly more that I might not even be aware of in my lineage. Good or bad, right or wrong, it's a fact.
I would say some Native people have felt periodically is the necessity of denying Africanness. But that necessity has been created by a steady stream of white originating argument about claiming that you cannot be Indian if you are also black. Initially, it was not Native people who were making that argument. Whites made that argument. in the process of disinheriting Native people in various kinds of ways. And some Native people have had to feel they have had to echo those arguments to achieve any kind of regaining of their birthright.
I guess the way it works is people are so used to seeing what is depicted as an Indian within the movies, the old movies and things. So if you don't look that way, they don't expect you to be Indian. They think you're either black or Hispanic or something else. But most people don't perceive you as an Indian if you don't look like that poster type Indian that they have on TV.
Who you are is what you were raised and what you believe in your heart and in your soul. It's not something that you take out of the closet and put on because it's the fashion.
I am a Mashantucket Pequot tribal member. I became federally recognized in 1993. Previous to that, I was always known to be a Afro-American. I was told as I was younger that we have native blood, if you will, and relatives of the Narragansett and the Pequots. I remember as I was growing up, the question was asked a lot if I'm mulatto because of my light skin. And I'm like, no, there are no Caucasians in my family as I know of. But it came clear to me when I was told more of my native side. So that explained to me why the skin is so light. And till this day, I let people know that I am both Native American and Afro-American. I'm very proud of it. And I don't think there's anyone that's going to tell me that I'm not two different, Portuguese, Spanish. I know that's in our bloodline as well. But there's only so much you can put. They don't put on the application, what are you, mutt? That'll be the easiest thing to do. But we don't do that for some reason. We can mutt a dog, but we can't mutt a human being.
It always reminds me of the children's game, paper covers rock, rock breaks scissors, scissors cut paper kind of thing, with respect to this blood business, that any number of drops of so-called white blood don't have any effect on whether a black person is black or whether an Indian is Indian, okay? But one drop of African blood, and suddenly an Indian isn't Indian and a white isn't white.
Here in Lexington, Kentucky, it's so important. People honestly don't look at me on the street and see my name, Victor Hassing. Oh yeah, Narragansett. Probably doesn't dawn on them. It probably says, African American by virtue of my pigmentation. But they need to see the best African American they can see if that's what they see in me. They need to see the best Native American that they can see if that's what they see in me. I doubt if they see the European blood that I have in my line because that's not relevant to them. Because my pigment suggests something different to them. But that's their problems, their issues to deal with. But they've got to see the best me that they can see.
Indian is a cultural question, it seems to me, and it's a cultural question. When the federal government conducts hearings on whether a tribe is authentic or not, talks about practices, talks about organization, all of those are cultural questions, and yet the mainstream white community uses the term Indian as a racial term and sees one drop of black blood as the sort of rock that breaks the scissors, or the paper that covers the rock.
There is no reason why one has to aspire to be something one is not. There's no reason why one should not be a mixture of Native American and African American, or even European American, and be proud of it. In each of those heritages, in each of those histories, there are things to be proud of.
Each one of us chooses a culture. Each one of us sees ourselves, images ourselves as a part of a group. We all need to belong to groups. There's nothing in the world wrong with that. What is important is that we should look to our own group, look to ourselves, learn who we are, be comfortable with who we are, be proud of who we are, and use our own culture base as the basis for that pride.
Someone who is a quarter French Canadian and a quarter Italian and half Irish, to be one of those things. And or asks them to exclude all but one of those as a way of making their own identity. And people ask that of African descended people, and they ask that of native descended people all the time.
I'm not going to tell someone you are or you aren't who you say you are. I think that we need to have fundamental respect for people as individuals as well as communities. And when someone says to me, I am an Indian, I'm an African Indian, I am white, I accept what those people tell me. I think that the whole notion of ascribing ethnicity to people is something that we should have left in the 19th century.
Nowhere is the desire to find harmony and strength in these blended identities more pronounced than in the way parents view interracial children.
My name is Darrell Wixon, and I am half black and Wampanoag. My dad was known to many people as a Sachem, which in our language, if you translate that into English, would be a chief. And he worked a lot for the benefit of the people. And he believed strongly in that way of thinking. And because he had that strength in that direction, he instilled that into us as his children.
I have 2 children, a son and a daughter, and I have 1 granddaughter. And my children were raised just like I was raised in both heritages. They know that they're Afro-American, but I have raised them in a Native American culture, with them not forgetting that they are Afro-American, so that they know all their roots of the African American, and that they definitely know their Native American roots, because we speak about it, we live it every day.
My children, I have a 12-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter. My children are also of a mixed background, naturally. Their father being Afro-American and their mother being Native American. And my children are raised as such. Their father is very active and very proud and very involved in his history and his culture. And that has been shared on with the children from the time of birth, as well as my background and the way that I was raised, being Narragansett, has also been shared with the children since birth. So my children have a very well-balanced view of who they are and what they are, and they embrace both of their cultures wholeheartedly, and are very active and participate in all of the cultural events, both with me and in our tribe and with their father and his family.
I want my children to be as aware of their native background as they are their African American background. That comes not only from my side of the family, but through my wife's as well, and that there is indeed European American blood in them as well. Now, what they choose to do with it as they grow, provided they have the information, is up to them to establish for themselves.
Black, Native American, white, because always remember that your family, regardless how large or small it is, we all have different cultures in it. You know, I have white people in my family, I have black people in my family, I have Portuguese, I have whatever I have. Don't look at your family and don't look at their skin color, is what I'm saying. That is your family, that's your bloodline. These people are your blood. You should not be prejudiced against your own family, because that will create war within itself.
The way my background is being half and half. My children don't have that, because they are instilled being Indian on both sides. So, and because of my dad and the influence of my own family, I was able to see certain things and have another mate in life that's also a Native person. So with that, it makes us stronger as a people. As far as blood and as far as culture, it comes back. And with us as a people that have been this type of way of thinking, that the way I think myself, also have tried to marry within their own and keep that blood going strong as a people. And so with that, we're not being wiped out. We're not being assimilated. Many of us, we are becoming stronger.
My son was asked by a reporter the other day how come he was so good in basketball. He told the reporter, if you were black and Indian, you'd be good too. So, some of your world's greatest athletes, Jim Thorpe was a Native American. Jesse Owens was black and Indian. So we're unique and we're special, and my kids understand that. I feel like they were raised in a traditional Indian home. You know, when your wife's full-blood Cherokee and your dad's half Indian, and you speak Cherokee every day, a little of that rubs off on you.
I think there is now a greater tolerance in American society for difference. It is perhaps the case, although this is a contested statement, it is perhaps the case that the American pie is not as large as it once had been. But I think America is still a work in progress.
I think people of African Indian ancestry, we don't know what to do with them. Are they Indian? Are they black? We're not ready to acknowledge them as black Indians or Indian blacks the way they're willing to acknowledge them themselves. So I think it's important to acknowledge who they are, that they have a history, that history is important to American history.
You know, when people first fall in love with each other, there's one particular thing that perhaps attracts them to each other. And I remember, the one thing I will always remember when I asked my mom and dad, what was it about each other that, how did you two get together? My mom said that she absolutely loved my father's dark, rich skin, deep brown eyes, and this long, dark, wavy hair. And my father said that he had adored the fact that my mother had this really coral-colored skin and these sort of sable-colored eyes. I remember my dad often spoke of my mother's sable eyes. And rounder cheeks, and they were just opposites of each other as far as features are concerned, and they loved that about each other.
A lot of it has to do with spirit. If the spirit's inside you, and you feel a certain way, then that's the people that you are. That's the people that you're going to be.
There is definitely an invisible bond there, a sort of umbilical cord, as it were, that has been passed on from my grandmother and her grandmother before her, that have all somehow culminated in this wonderful, beautiful little spirit that is my daughter. And it's not on paper. It's not anything that she can go to a governmental role necessarily and find validation in, but it is most certainly a valid part of her being.
Being a black Indian means living a rich and sometimes difficult history. It means not simply tolerating differences, but learning to embrace them. And in doing so, matters of blood and color and culture give way to a truer sense of who we really are.